The fluorescent lights hummed above the third floor of Seattle General, casting everything in a shade of white that made the living look half dead. Laura Bennett moved through the oncology wing with her head bent slightly forward, her faded scrubs, the ones with the coffee stain near the left pocket that wouldn't wash out, catching on the corner of a supply cart as she passed. She didn't look up. She never looked up. The morning shift had been assigned to someone else, someone newer, someone whose presence didn't create the kind of silence that made administrators nervous. Laura got the late shifts. The difficult cases. The patients no one else wanted. This was how you disappeared in a hospital. You became useful in ways that didn't require conversation. Her hands moved with surgical precision as she checked the 4 line on 347B, the elderly woman with stage 4 pancreatic cancer who'd stopped asking for visitors 3 weeks ago. The needle went in smooth. The tape held. She adjusted the drip rate without looking at the monitor, muscle memory from somewhere else, somewhere she wasn't allowed to remember. The antiseptic smell of the wing mixed with something underneath it, something like copper and old bandages, and Laura breathed through her mouth instead as she moved to the next room. Her left hand trembled slightly as she reached for the chart on the medication cart, and she shifted the clipboard to cover it, hiding what 18 years of nerve damage insisted on revealing. Sangin. The name hung in her mind like a word in a language that was no longer supposed to exist. She didn't let the tremor show on her face. She had been trained too long ago to let her body betray her, even when her own body was the only thing betraying her anymore. The physician's lounge was visible through the glass partition as she passed, and she caught the edge of Dr. Ashford's silhouette, the perfect white coat, the gold cufflinks that caught the light like small promises of importance, the way he sat in that particular chair at the head of the table as if it had been assigned to him at birth. His voice carried through the doorway, something about mortality statistics and risk management, and Laura didn't break stride. She had learned, over 13 years at Seattle General, that the less she was noticed by people like Ashford, the longer she could do her work. The less anyone knew her name, the safer everything became. She found the supply closet on the east wing, the small one, the one no one else used because it was tucked behind the stairwell and required an extra 30 seconds to reach. Her locker was in the back, behind the boxes of sterile gauze and the replacement pump cartridges. She opened it slowly. The jacket hanging there was old, the blue fabric worn at the edges, and inside the lining, sewn with thread that had faded to nearly white, was a unit patch. The stitching was crude. She'd done it herself, 15 years ago, in a barracks room in Kandahar before the extraction went wrong and the Pentagon buried everything and told her to forget she'd ever existed. The patch was small enough to hide. The weight of it was enormous. She touched it once, just the edge of her finger against the stitching, and then she closed the locker and walked back out into the hallway. The ER doors burst open at 14:41, and the sound of them hit the quiet afternoon like a gunshot. Paramedics wheeled in a stretcher, wheels squeaking against the polished floor, and the voice of the lead paramedic cut through the controlled chaos, 32-year-old male. Paralyzed from the waist down, severed spinal artery at L2, we're looking at massive internal hemorrhage. A woman's voice rose above the radio chatter, his sister, probably, her voice cracking on the word please, 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 and Laura looked up from the medication cart she'd been restocking. The veteran's face was conscious, his eyes moving, tracking the lights above him as they wheeled him deeper into the trauma bay. His sister gripped the edge of the stretcher, her knuckles white, her mouth forming shapes that weren't quite words anymore. The man's eyes were the color of burned coffee, and for exactly 2 seconds, Laura's gaze locked with his. She saw what was there, not panic, not fear, but a kind of absolute calm that only came from having already been to the bottom of the world. She saw someone who understood that some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. Then she looked away. The trauma bay doors closed, and the sister was left standing in the hallway with her hands open at her sides, making a sound like an animal that had been struck. Laura continued restocking medications. This was what you did. You stayed in your lane. You did your job. You didn't get involved. What happened next didn't just silence the room, it changed the direction of everything that would follow. Dr. Ashford appeared in the trauma bay at 14:52, his entrance preceded by the sound of his shoes on the tile floor, sharp and deliberate. He moved like someone accustomed to rooms parting in front of him, and they did. The ER nurses stepped back. The paramedics finished their handoff. The veteran sister pressed herself against the wall of the bay, her eyes following Ashford as he approached the bed. Dr. Ashford pulled the imaging films from the light box above the monitor, studied them for approximately 4 seconds, and then turned toward the trauma bay door. The CT scan showed the vertebral artery damage with crystalline clarity, a clean transection at the L2 level, the kind of injury that required immediate surgical intervention and a surgeon willing to operate on something that wasn't supposed to be survivable. Ashford walked directly to the consultation room, his gait the kind of precise efficiency that came from knowing, absolutely, that no one would question where he was going. The consultation room occupied a corner of the 3rd floor, separated from the main ER by a corridor and 2 sets of double doors. It was designed to be soundproof, though it wasn't, and it was designed to feel like a place where difficult decisions were made with wisdom and compassion, though it didn't feel that way at all. It felt like a room where things died. Ashford entered first. Then Chen, the cardiovascular surgeon, her dark hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her face into a permanent expression of concern. Then Rodriguez from trauma. Patel from spinal surgery. Morrison from general surgery. Kim, the newest attending. And Weiss, who had delivered more bad news in his career than most people received in a lifetime. 7 doctors. The numbers were important. The numbers would matter later. They stood around the light box like priests around an altar, studying the scans in a silence that was broken only by the sound of someone's latex gloves being snapped off. The radiographs were unambiguous, the spinal artery was completely severed, the hemorrhage was massive, and the patient was technically dead already. The only thing keeping him alive was the rapid for infusion and the fact that his heart hadn't quite accepted the news yet. Ashford spoke first, his voice carrying the tone of someone who was simply stating facts, not making a choice. The vascular anatomy here is impossible to repair without opening the entire retroperitoneal space. The blood loss alone would be catastrophic. Rodriguez nodded slowly. Even if we could control the hemorrhage, the spinal damage is complete. He'll never walk again. The quality of life post-operative is negligible at best. Chen was already shaking her head. The risk of infection is substantial given the nature of the injury. We're looking at months of recovery with a high probability of sepsis. This is litigation waiting to happen. Patel spoke quietly, his voice like someone reading from a prepared statement. I cannot in good conscience recommend operative intervention on this case. The risk-benefit analysis is untenable. Morrison, who had been silent until this moment, finally spoke. Our hospital's mortality statistics are already under scrutiny from CMS. One bad outcome here, and we're facing a peer review investigation. Kim, the newest attending, opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it. The silence that followed was absolute. Weiss moved toward the door without saying anything, which said everything. Ashford pulled the films from the light box one by one, sliding them back into the envelope with the methodical precision of someone filing away a problem. I'll inform the family that we cannot offer operative intervention, he said. We can offer comfort care. Palliative sedation if he requests it. And we can make sure he's not in pain, at least. The 7 doctors filed out of the consultation room in the order they'd entered it, and none of them looked back. What happened next ended careers. But nobody knew that yet. The consultation room at Seattle General smelled like industrial coffee and resignation. 7 doctors stood around the light box, their white coats forming a wall of collective refusal. Dr. Chen shook her head at the scans first. Severed spinal artery. Litigation waiting to happen. Rodriguez closed the file with the finality of a coffin lid. The hospital can't afford another wrongful death suit. Patel crossed his arms. Morrison glanced at his watch. Kim and Weiss exchanged the kind of look that meant they'd already made up their minds before walking into the room. Dr. Ashford nodded approvingly at each declination, his face carrying the calm satisfaction of a man watching dominoes fall exactly where he'd arranged them. Laura stood in the doorway, her oncology badge catching the fluorescent glare. She'd watched the refusals stack like bodies. 7 physicians, each finding reasons to walk away from a paralyzed Special Forces veteran whose sister was in the waiting room, probably praying to a god who apparently had a full schedule. The voice that came out of Laura's throat was steady. Quiet. I'll take the case. The room went dead silent. Ashford's eyes cut toward her with the precision of a scalpel. Nurse Bennett, this is a physician decision. His tone carried the weight of institutional hierarchy, each were designed to remind her of her place in the food chain. But the veteran's sister had begun weeping in the waiting area. The monitors were beeping their mechanical countdown. 7 doctors had walked. Someone had to stand. I'll take the case, Laura repeated. What happened next happened in Ashford's office 20 minutes later, but not in his office. He cornered her in the patient's room itself, ensuring maximum audience for the demolition. The veteran lay unconscious on the gurney, his sister standing vigil, and Ashford's voice carried through the open door like a prosecutor building a case for execution. You think 18 months of nursing school makes you qualified to question 7 board-certified physicians? His face reddened with the heat of manufactured indignation. You're a trauma tourist, Bennett. Playing hero with someone else's life. Someone else's family. He gestured toward the sister, whose tear-streaked face had turned toward Laura like a judge awaiting verdict. You have no idea what you're doing. This isn't a TV show. This is a man's death warrant. Laura's jaw tightened. Just barely. A muscle movement smaller than breath. She took one measured breath, the kind of breath a sniper takes before the trigger squeeze, and when she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from the deferential tone that had carried her through 18 months of survival at this hospital. Some of us became nurses to save lives, not statistics. The words landed like a round hitting body armor. Ashford's face darkened. He opened his mouth to respond, closed it, then turned and left without another word. But the look in his eyes had shifted from contempt to something sharper. Something recognizing a threat. The sister's hand found Laura's arm. By noon, a formal written reprimand appeared on the unit bulletin board in the break room, printed on hospital letterhead with the weight of institutional judgment. Nurse Laura Bennett, formal disciplinary notice, date, timestamp, violation, reckless disregard for established protocol and chain of command. Unauthorized medical decision-making. Insubordination toward attending physician. The notice was signed by Ashford and countersigned by the chief nursing officer. Every staff member who passed that board would read it. Every staff member would know that Laura had stepped out of line. She entered the break room at 13:15 on that same day. 3 nurses were gathered at the corner table, Jackson, Maria, and Tom. People she'd shared shifts with. People she'd covered for when they called in sick. Jackson was the first to move. She gathered her lunch container without making eye contact. Maria stood a half-second later, her movements careful and deliberate, the movements of someone following an unwritten script. Tom waited exactly long enough to make it seem like an independent decision, then joined them. None of them spoke. None of them looked at her. The door swung shut behind them with the soft sound of professional survival instinct. Laura sat alone at the table. Her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had grown cold somewhere between the morning chaos and this moment of isolation. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with their fluorescent hum, a sound like electricity counting down to something inevitable. She could feel the weight of the reprimand on the bulletin board behind her, could feel every glance from staff passing in the hallway, could feel the slow, methodical construction of her professional execution. A voice came from the doorway. Not Ashford this time. A woman. The veteran's sister. Why would you risk everything? She asked. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hands trembling with the specific tremor of someone whose world had narrowed to a single moment, a single decision, a single person who'd refused to walk away. Laura stared at her own scarred knuckles, faint white lines that told stories this hospital would never read. Because 7 people already walked away, she whispered. Someone had to stay. The sister's hand covered her mouth. She nodded without speaking and left Laura alone again, alone with the cold coffee and the fluorescent buzz and the slow, methodical knowledge that everything was about to get much worse. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the next 48 hours, Dr. Ashford moved with the calculated precision of a man who'd already won before the battle started. At 6 o'clock on the morning after the reprimand, a new schedule was posted. Laura was reassigned to the night shift effective immediately. The official memo cited operational efficiency needs and appropriate staff distribution. What it actually meant was isolation. What it actually meant was removing her from the day staff, removing her from witnesses, removing her from everyone who might advocate for her. She would work when the hospital slept. She would be alone. At 8:11 that same morning, a new amendment appeared in the Critical Care Protocols document, the one that governed every major medical decision in the facility. Dr. Ashford had added exactly 14 words in subsection 4.3, all invasive interventions by nursing staff require prior attending physician authorization. 14 words. That's all it took. Laura discovered the change at 22:15 that night when she attempted to adjust the veteran's medication drip and the hospital system locked her out. Access denied. She tried again. Same result. A message on the screen: this action requires attending physician approval. Dr. Ashford has been notified. Dr. Ashford had been asleep for 4 hours. The phone calls came that same day. 3 of them. Laura didn't know about them until later, but Marcus Webb did. Marcus Webb was a quiet Marine veteran who worked in hospital IT, and he'd noticed the unusual access patterns in Ashford's office phone records. The first call went to Patricia Holbrook, a board member with financial interests in the hospital's liability insurance. Ashford's voice on the recording was smooth, concerned, clinical. "I'm troubled about Nurse Bennett's mental state. She's showing signs of PTSD, reckless decisions, disregard for established protocol, insubordination when questioned. In my professional opinion, she's a patient safety risk." The second call went to Stephen Walsh in risk management. "I need to document this formally. Nurse Bennett demonstrated signs of being mentally unstable. She's refusing to acknowledge her limitations. This is a liability we need to address before she harms someone." The third call went to the chief nursing officer. "I'd like to recommend a credential review for Nurse Bennett. For patient safety." 3 phone calls. 3 times his voice, low and professional and absolutely certain, describing a woman he'd watched save a life as a dangerous liability. The veteran's condition stabilized temporarily on the second day. His makeshift clot held. The arterial pressure steadied. But Laura, watching the monitors during her night shift, recognized the pattern, the subtle downward trend that she'd seen in field hospitals in Sangin, the kind of trend that meant the body was losing the internal war in slow motion. The patient was stable on a knife's edge. One cut, and everything would collapse. At 23:45 on the second night, she discovered her locker had been inspected. The contents were still there, but displaced. A security memo was taped inside the door: controlled substance audit, 11/15/1422. Items photographed and catalogued. Photographs in the file showed her personal items, her water bottle, her jacket lining, everything arranged for documentation. The implication was crystalline. They were building a case. Not just for insubordination. For something criminal. The State Board review notice arrived in her hospital mailbox at 1:08 a.m. Credential review initiated. Nurse Laura Bennett, flagged for judgment concerns, protocol violations, and scope of practice exceeded. The envelope was thick. Official. Final. Rain started at 0:30. Cold November rain. The kind that came down like judgment, like the sky had made a decision and was enforcing it. Laura sat in her car in the parking garage with the engine off, rain hammering the windshield like applause for her own professional destruction. Her hands were shaking too hard to turn the ignition. She read the credential notice 3 times, understanding it less each time. She'd survived Sangin. She'd survived a black op that the Pentagon had erased from history. She'd survived becoming invisible. But she couldn't survive this. The rain fell harder. She drove to the cemetery. The rain fell harder as Laura stood at the marble headstone, hands trembling in a way she hadn't allowed herself in front of a single living person. The stone was cold. The name carved into it was cold. Everything about this place was cold, and that felt right, fitting, because Captain James Bennett had been cold for 2 years and 17 days, and she was only now standing here to tell him she'd failed him again. "I tried," she whispered, her voice breaking against the downpour. The cemetery was empty at this hour, just before dawn, just before the city woke to demand things from her she no longer knew how to give. "I tried to save someone. I tried to matter again. And they're destroying me for it." Her knees buckled. She sank into the mud beside the headstone, one hand pressed against the marble. The rain soaked through her scrubs, through the thin jacket she'd worn to the hospital and stripped off in the car, through everything that was supposed to protect her from the world outside. There was no protection. There never had been. The operation in Sangin Valley had been black. The extraction had gone sideways. She'd pulled out 17 wounded under fire while her husband covered the retreat, while the rotor wash of the MH6 little bird hammered down on them like God's own fist, while everything they'd trained for, everything they'd sworn to do, came apart like wet paper. James had been hit on the final push to the aircraft. The Pentagon had classified the whole thing 3 hours later. Within a week, there was no operation. No extraction. No 17 wounded. No James. Officially, Major Laura Bennett had never existed at all. "I buried you," she whispered to the stone. "And then I buried myself." 2 years of disappearing. 2 years of working in an oncology unit in Houston, of introducing herself as just Laura, of keeping her hands steady while they trembled underneath, of watching other people save lives and being told her contribution didn't matter because her service record had been erased by people in offices she'd never see. She'd thought if she could just save one person, if she could just prove that her training, her muscle memory, her hands that had held soldiers together on blooded stretchers still meant something, then maybe the weight of invisible service would finally lift. Instead, Dr. Ashford had pressed her down further. She touched the headstone again, her palm flat against the granite, cold as a surgical table. The inscription read, "Captain James Bennett, United States Army Special Forces. Beloved husband. Hero." The word hero carved into stone meant nothing. Heroes disappeared. Heroes got erased. Heroes went into Sangin and didn't come back, and the world kept spinning, indifferent. Her phone buzzed at 1:36. The hospital's automated scheduling system confirmed what she already knew, her reassignment to the night shift, permanent. Effective immediately. No consultation, no discussion. Dr. Ashford had moved the chess piece while she was kneeling in the rain. He was competent, she had to give him that. Methodical. He understood that the best way to destroy someone wasn't to make a scene. It was to restrict their access, isolate them in the darkness, make sure they were nowhere near the ER when the paralyzed veteran crashed. Because he would crash. She knew that the way she knew how to perform emergency field thoracotomy, the way she knew how to compress an aorta manually, the way she knew the look in a dying man's eyes. The severed spinal artery would hold for a day, maybe 2. Then the makeshift clot would dissolve, and he'd bleed out internally, and she wouldn't be there to save him. Ashford would make sure of it. She drove back to Seattle General as dawn broke, her hands finally steady on the steering wheel again. The city was waking up. Traffic began to move. The world kept going, indifferent to graves and erased service records and nurses kneeling in the mud. She found a parking spot in the staff lot and sat there for 4 minutes, just breathing, just letting the morning light wash over her until the trembling stopped and the mask could go back on. At 2 o'clock, she was standing outside the veteran's room, watching his monitors through the window. His sister slept in the chair beside him, her head tilted at an angle that would cause neck pain when she woke up. The veteran's vital signs were stable, blood pressure 118/76, heart rate 62, oxygen saturation 97%. The arterial line was patent. The 4 fluids were running clear. For now, he was intact. Laura made a decision that would cost her everything. She would monitor him from the nurse's station. Protocol be damned. Ashford's restrictions could go to hell. She wasn't a nurse anymore, she was a soldier standing over a wounded comrade, and soldiers didn't leave people unprotected because some administrator wanted to protect the hospital's mortality statistics. She returned to the nurse's station and logged into the central monitor system. Ashford's amended care protocols restricted her access to critical patient data. She sat there and stared at the screen that wouldn't load, at the barrier he'd built between her and the information she needed. Her jaw clenched. She counted her breathing, 4 in, hold for 4, out for 4. Military breathing. The breathing that came before the violence. At 2:13, the veteran's arterial line alarm began to chime. Not a normal alert. Not a displacement of the line or a loose connection. This was the sound of something fundamental shifting inside his body, something breaking, something that 7 doctors had been terrified to touch. The alarm escalated, 3 chimes, 5 chimes, then continuous. His blood pressure was dropping. Fast. 88/54. 81/48. The oxygen saturation began to decline. 96%. 94%. 92%. Laura moved without thinking. Without permission. Without the protocols that Ashford had written in his precise, careful handwriting. She was at the veteran's bedside in 4 seconds, her hands moving with muscle memory from a dozen combat surgeries in Sangin, from a training that the Pentagon had tried to erase but couldn't quite scrub from her bones. His sister jolted awake. "What's happening?" "Internal bleeding," Laura said. Her voice had changed. It was no longer the deferential murmur of a floor nurse. It was the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Stay back." She initiated a rapid infusion with the level 1 rapid infuser, cold blood flowing into his veins at maximum rate. 500 milliliters. Then 1,000. She pressed the call button for the trauma team and spoke before anyone could respond. "Possible arterial re-rupture, ER Trauma Bay 2, we need CT with angiography, prepare for emergency operative intervention." The attending in the trauma bay heard the authority in her voice and moved. She didn't know her own rank. She didn't know that the woman calling out orders had 2 silver stars and a bronze star with Vela locked in a storage unit 3 miles away. She just knew that the voice on the intercom carried the weight of someone who had done this before, and she moved fast. Laura maintained the infusion, her hand steady as surgical lasers, her eyes tracking every number on every monitor. The oxygen saturation climbed again, 94%. 95%. 96%. His blood pressure stabilized at 102/62. Ringer's lactate flooded his veins, buying time, buying the minutes they needed to get him to CT, to confirm what she already knew. The arterial repair had failed. The clot was dissolving. He was bleeding out internally, and if she hadn't been standing at his bedside, if she'd been forced to work the night shift behind Ashford's restrictions, he would have died at 2:14 with his sister asleep in the chair beside him. The trauma team arrived at 2:19. She handed off the patient with a clinical precision that left no room for doubt. Blood type O positive. Allergies, none. Medications, none. Current vitals stable and trending. She'd bought him 2 hours. Maybe 3, if they moved fast enough in the operating room. As they wheeled him out of the ER, the veteran's hand reached out. His fingers brushed hers, and she felt the trembling there. Not fear. She understood now, in that moment, that it wasn't fear at all. It was recognition. The monitors started screaming at 2:14. Laura was 2 floors up, charting in the oncology wing, when the code alarm punched through the intercom. Trauma Bay 3. Her hands froze on the keyboard. She didn't move. Didn't breathe. Then she heard the secondary alert, the veteran's room number echoing across the hospital network, and something locked into place behind her ribs like a rifle bolt chambering around. She was moving before her brain caught up, her legs carrying her down the stairwell in leaps, taking the steps 3 at a time, the fluorescent lights blurring overhead as she descended. The trauma floor opened like a wound, and she could hear them already, the alarms, the shouting, the terrible wet sound of a body hemorrhaging from the inside out. His makeshift repair was failing. The arterial branch she'd identified was coming apart, the sutures unraveling like a promise nobody kept, and blood was flooding into his chest cavity with the relentless pressure of a burst dam. She burst through the ICU doors and didn't slow down. The veteran sister was screaming, a sound like an animal caught in steel, her hands pressed against the glass partition. The monitors displayed the catastrophe in cold green numbers, blood pressure dropping like a stone down a well, 98/62, 87/51, 72/40 and still falling, each number a countdown to flatline. His heart rate climbed past 160, desperate, fighting, already losing. Laura's mind shifted the way it always had in the field, the way it had in Sangin when the convoy got hit and there were bodies and not enough hands, and the choice was simple: move or let someone die. The civilian part of her, the part that had spent 2 years learning to ask permission and wait for authorization and defer to the men in white coats, simply ceased to exist. She hit the code button with the heel of her hand. I need the crash cart. Now. The resident on duty, fresh out of medical school, probably 19 minutes of actual trauma experience, spun toward her. Code team's on the way, the surgical. Not fast enough. Laura tore open the veteran's gown, her eyes already mapping the anatomy beneath the skin, already seeing what needed to happen next. Her hands moved like a woman who'd done this under fire, in sandstorms, with mortars falling close enough that the impact made the earth jump. She grabbed the emergency supplies kit, her fingers finding the scalpel like muscle memory was its own kind of prayer. The sister was still screaming. Laura's voice cut through it, not loud, but sharp, the kind of command authority that stops people mid-thought. Get her out. Now. A nurse moved without asking questions. The sister was escorted from the bay, her screams fading down the corridor. Laura didn't look up. She made the incision with the confidence of someone who understood that hesitation kills people faster than most weapons ever could. The blade went through skin, through the superficial fascia, through muscle and into the chest cavity with the precision of a combat surgeon operating by candlelight in a cave while Taliban mortars walked rounds up the mountainside. Blood sprayed across her scrubs, hot and copper bright. She grabbed the rib spreader and felt the resistance, bone against steel, then felt it give, the ribs spreading apart like opening a door to somewhere sacred and terrible. The aorta was in front of her. Bleeding. The branch where the sutures had failed was pumping blood into the space around his heart like the universe was trying to drown him from the inside. She reached in without flinching, her gloved hand finding the artery, her fingers closing around it with the pressure of someone who'd held arterial bleeds closed while waiting for a medevac that might not arrive in time. Manual compression. No equipment. Just the pressure of her hands and the knowledge that if she moved, if she released, if she lost focus for even 1 second, the hemorrhage would restart and he'd be gone inside 90 seconds. Get me a level 1 rapid infuser, she said, her voice absolutely level, absolutely calm, the voice of someone who'd given orders in languages that sounded like stones being thrown. Type O negative, push it wide open. And get me 2 units of TXA. 1 gram over 10 minutes. Now. The resident was staring at her like she'd materialized from a parallel universe where nurses performed open-chest surgery in ICU bays. The surgical tech, an older woman who'd probably been doing this since before the resident was born, moved immediately. You got it. The veteran's blood pressure began to stabilize. 78/45. 82/48. The hemorrhage wasn't restarting. Her hands held. Her focus didn't waver. Her breathing remained the rhythm of someone underwater, controlled, measured, survivable. The surgical team burst through the doors at 2:21, Dr. Chen in the lead, and froze in the doorway. For 1 impossible second, there was nothing but the sound of the ventilator and the monitors and the soft wet sound of blood moving through tubing. Chen saw a nurse, a woman in scrubs soaked in blood, her hands inside a patient's open chest, managing an arterial hemorrhage with the muscle memory of someone who'd done this on a battlefield, and his expression moved through confusion, then shock, then something that looked like recognition of a line he'd crossed a long time ago and never fully admitted. Spinal artery branch failure, Laura reported, her eyes still on her work, her voice steady as a rifle sight. Sutures didn't hold. I've got manual arterial compression. He's lost approximately 4 liters. Pressure stabilizing with aggressive fluid resuscitation and TXA protocol. He needs an OR now. Chen moved, muscle memory of his own, and took over the compression while Laura stepped back, her hands falling to her sides. They rushed the veteran toward the OR on a tide of controlled chaos, the surgical team moving with the precision of people who understood that every second was the difference between alive and not. Laura stood in the hallway at 3:45, blood drying on her scrubs like a map of survival. Her hands were still steady. Her breathing was still controlled. The trembling hadn't started yet because the trembling was a luxury for people who were finished working. Dr. Ashford emerged from his office like a man who'd been waiting. He'd been called in for the code, of course he had. The attending physicians needed to know the details of the catastrophe that had just unfolded in their hospital. His face went through a progression, confusion, then comprehension, then the kind of white-hot rage that comes from watching your carefully orchestrated power structure get dismantled by someone you'd already decided didn't exist. He stepped toward her with the measured pace of a man who'd learned that controlled threat was more effective than shouting. "You just ended your career," he said quietly, each word a blade. "Performing open-chest surgery without credentials. Without authorization. In direct violation of hospital protocol and my explicit restrictions." The hallway had gone very quiet. Other staff members had noticed. They'd seen her walk out of the trauma bay covered in the evidence of someone doing the impossible. "You performed a procedure reserved for trauma surgeons," Ashford continued, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "You violated sterile protocol. You contaminated a surgical field. You made decisions that could have resulted in criminal liability for this institution." He stepped closer. "Security will escort you out at 8 o'clock. Consider yourself immediately terminated pending board review. And I will personally ensure you never work in healthcare again. Not in Texas. Not anywhere." Laura took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes before the radio call that sends you back into the fire. She looked at him with the eyes of someone who'd already lived through the worst thing that could happen, someone who'd already lost everything that mattered, and found him wanting. "He's alive," she said quietly. "That's what matters." She walked past him to the locker room without waiting for a response. Changed out of her scrubs into fresh ones, her hands moving on their own, autopilot until her fingers found the old jacket hanging in the back of her locker. The one she'd kept from before, when she was someone else entirely. She opened the collar and stared at the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, the same patch that was still woven into the identity of the paralyzed veteran, now bleeding less and breathing better because she'd known exactly how to save him. The knowledge that her attempt to disappear, to have a normal life, to pretend she was just a nurse and nothing more, had just come to an end sat on her chest like stone. She sat on the bench for exactly 3 minutes. Then her phone rang. The phone call lasted 47 seconds. Marcus Webb, the Marine veteran IT specialist who ran Seattle General Security Infrastructure, spoke in the clipped cadence of someone who'd spent 6 years dismantling insurgent networks before trading his rifle for a keyboard. "Major," he said, and that single word told Laura he'd already pulled her file, already understood what the hospital system's automated flags had just screamed into the Pentagon's encrypted servers. "Your security clearance just triggered a notification. Federal level. You need to know what's happening on your end before it reaches ours." Laura stood in the parking lot, rain falling sideways in sheets that hammered against the concrete like machine gun fire. She didn't move. Didn't ask questions. Just listened. Marcus continued, "Someone's building a case against you. Credentials flagged for review. Locker inspected. 3 phone calls to board members at 22:47, 23:14, and 01:06 hours, all from Dr. Ashford's office line. He's documenting everything, reassignment orders, protocol amendments, a formal incident report that reads like a deposition." The rain pounded harder. Laura's scrubs clung to her shoulders, soaked through completely, and she could taste copper on her lip where she'd bitten through the skin an hour ago. "He's trying to terminate you before the background check can finish," Marcus said quietly. "Before anyone realizes what you actually are." Laura's voice came out steady as surgical steel. "How long until the Pentagon file reaches the hospital?" 2 hours, Marcus said. "Maybe 3. The sealed file is already in motion. Someone flagged your social security number when Ashford filed his disciplinary paperwork. Standard background check protocol triggered a classified alert. It's coming, Major. And when it lands, it's going to crack this hospital wide open." The line went dead. Laura stood in the rain for exactly 90 seconds, watching the emergency department entrance glow red under the ER lights, then walked back inside. Her scrubs left wet footprints across the tile floor like a trail of breadcrumbs leading straight to the administrative wing. She didn't change clothes. Didn't dry off. Didn't try to look less like a drowned ghost moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors of a place that had just decided to consume her alive. The conference room on the 3rd floor was already occupied when Administrator Victoria Morgan called an emergency board meeting at 08 for 7 hours. 2 hours and 41 minutes had passed since Marcus's call. The sealed Pentagon file lay on the mahogany table like a loaded revolver, its red security stamp visible from across the room. Dr. Ashford sat in the chair farthest from the door, his Rolex catching the morning light, his posture suggesting a man who believed himself untouchable. He'd built his career on statistics and liability mitigation, on the careful mathematics of acceptable losses. 7 doctors had refused to touch the veteran. 1 nurse had saved him. The math no longer worked in Ashford's favor. But he didn't know that yet. He was still calculating, still building his case, still operating under the assumption that in an institution built on hierarchies and credentials, a former oncology nurse with a psychiatric evaluation in progress couldn't possibly outrank a man with a 22-year tenure and 4 published articles on perioperative risk management. Administrator Morgan opened the sealed file with hands that didn't tremble. She read the first paragraph silently, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly, then looked up at the assembled board members. "Dr. Ashford," she said carefully, "I need you to explain the disciplinary paperwork you filed against Laura Bennett yesterday." Ashford straightened in his chair, his voice taking on the measured confidence of a man delivering a prepared testimony. "Victoria, I understand this may seem harsh, but the facts are clear. Ms. Bennett violated direct protocol, endangered a patient through reckless disregard for established procedure, and her psychiatric fitness has become a serious liability for this institution. I've documented everything. I have supporting communications from 3 board members you called between 22:41 and 1:06 this morning," Morgan interrupted, her voice like winter. "While simultaneously reassigning her to night shift, restricting her access to critical patients, and having security inspect her locker for controlled substances." Ashford's face didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation recalibrating in real time. "That standard procedure when what?" A man in a Navy SEAL Trident pin rose from the chair at the table's far end. His shoulders filled the space around him the way mountains fill valleys, and his voice carried the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "When you're trying to manufacture evidence against a decorated combat officer." Ashford's face cycled through 3 emotions in the space of 4 seconds. Confusion. Denial. The beginning of understanding. "I think there's been some confusion," he started, but Morgan was already reading aloud, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Major Laura Bennett, Special Forces Combat Medical Officer. 3 tours of duty. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Silver Stars." She paused between each phrase, letting the weight settle. "And a Defense Superior Service Medal for extracting 17 wounded personnel under sustained enemy fire in Sangin Valley, Helmand Province." The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric song. Ashford had opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. His hands, which had signed dozens of patient charts and 3 board recommendation letters, suddenly looked like the hands of a man holding nothing at all. The SEAL officer continued, "The mission Major Bennett led in Sangin was classified black. It was buried not because she failed, but because it succeeded. She extracted a CIA asset that prevented a terrorist attack on U.S. soil. The Pentagon doesn't forget those operations. They certainly don't forget the officers who led them. An FBI agent stood from the corner chair, a woman with gray eyes and a voice like polished concrete. Interfering with a federal security clearance investigation carries criminal penalties, Dr. Ashford. As does evidence tampering, harassment of a protected federal employee, and abuse of your institutional authority. Ashford's breathing had changed. You could see it now, his chest moving in smaller, faster increments, like a bird in a cage made of its own miscalculations. I didn't know, he said quietly. I didn't know what she was. Of course you didn't, Morgan said. And then the worst words a man like Ashford could hear, that's not my problem. Marcus Webb entered the conference room carrying a tablet computer, his dress uniform visible beneath his IT security jacket, the Marine insignia catching light on his sleeve. He was a man who understood systems, architectures, the careful weaving of data threads that either held institutions together or brought them crashing down. Dr. Ashford, he said quietly, his voice holding the absolute authority of someone stating documented fact, I need to show you something. The security footage played across the tablet screen with clinical precision. 23:17 hours the previous night, Ashford entering Laura's locker area in the surgical wing, gesturing to security personnel, directing them to photograph the contents of a locker that contained nothing but scrubs, a pair of combat boots with worn laces, and a photograph of a man in green beret uniform, her husband, James Bennett, killed in the same operation she wasn't allowed to remember. Then 22 minutes past 1 in the morning, after the rain, after the cemetery, after Laura had whispered apologies to a grave, Ashford returning alone to the security office. The footage showed him accessing the database system. His fingers moving across the keyboard with the careful precision of someone who'd watched enough procedural dramas to believe himself competent. Attempting to delete files. Overwriting timestamps. Destroying evidence of his own orchestrated misconduct. Marcus's voice hardened as he continued, I saved every frame to an encrypted backup and reported the tampering to hospital administration at 3:41 this morning. Before you even arrived at work. Ashford stood abruptly, his chair clattering backward against the wall with a sound like a gavel striking wood. This is a misunderstanding, I was simply trying to eliminate evidence, the FBI agent said flatly. Before a federal investigation could examine it. Morgan's voice cut across the room like a blade. Dr. Ashford, you're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. We're also reporting you to the State Medical Board for evidence tampering, harassment, and systematic abuse of your authority over subordinate staff. She paused, letting the silence settle around him like a burial shroud. You interfered with the investigation of a decorated officer. That's beyond institutional policy. That's criminal. The room held its breath. Ashford's face had drained of blood, leaving it the color of old paper. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, smaller somehow, compressed under the weight of understanding what he'd done. You don't understand the liability she created. The risk. One surgery like that and the entire hospital's malpractice insurance, she saved a man's life, Morgan said quietly. While you spent 48 hours trying to destroy hers. Security arrived 3 minutes later, 2 officers Laura didn't recognize, moving with the professional courtesy of men accustomed to removing people from positions they'd believed permanent. Ashford gathered his personal items, a framed photograph of his wife, a copy of his published article mounted on mahogany, a Mont-Blanc pen that probably cost more than Laura's entire month's rent. As they walked in toward the elevators, he passed Laura in the hallway outside the administrative offices. She stood perfectly still, her wet scrubs dripping rainwater onto the tile floor. She didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't acknowledge him with anything except her eyes, the kind of quiet, steady gaze that comes from having already survived the worst that any institution could do. His face cycled through desperation, then resignation, then something approaching shame, before the elevator doors closed and took him down. 30 seconds. That's all it took to end his career. The veteran sister found Laura 20 minutes later in the trauma bay, where she was reviewing charts for the incoming shift with the same methodical precision she'd maintained for 18 months of invisible service. Is it true? The sister asked, her voice trembling. All of it? The Pentagon, the medals, Sangin. Laura looked up from the chart. Her jaw was tight, but her voice came out calm. I'm going on break, she said simply. The sister's face crumpled into something between laughter and tears. Staff members began emerging from patient rooms and stations throughout the department, nurses, residents, techs, gathering at a distance, their expressions shifting from shock to something approaching awe. Dr. Chen, the radiologist who'd stood silent when Ashford first called Laura's competence into question, approached with her face flushed. Major Bennett, she began, then stopped. Tried again. Laura. I should have stood with you. Laura's voice remained soft, almost gentle in its precision. 7 people said no. I just said yes. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something colder and more true, the recognition that courage isn't about being brave in the moment. It's about doing the right thing when 7 other people, equally qualified and equally afraid, have already chosen otherwise. 6 months later, the veteran walks into the physical therapy wing of Seattle General at exactly 7:33 in the morning, his cane moving across the floor with the careful rhythm of someone learning his body all over again. His son stands beside him, a boy of 12 with his father's jawline and eyes that have learned to hold grief without breaking. Laura moves through the trauma department in supervisor scrubs now, her promotion effective 3 weeks after Ashford's termination, and she visits him at the same time every shift, a routine they'd established without discussion, the way people who've survived certain things together often do. Recovery's ahead of schedule, she tells him, reviewing his chart with the clinical precision that's become her signature. He nods toward the hallway where a framed photograph has appeared on the main board, Major Laura Bennett in service dress uniform, younger but with the same steady eyes, receiving the Bronze Star from a 3-star general. The hospital board commissioned it after Ashford's dismissal, a quiet acknowledgement of what they'd almost destroyed, what they'd failed to see until federal security clearance protocols forced them to look. My son wants to join Special Forces, the veteran says quietly, his voice carrying a question without asking one. Laura's throat tightens. They talk for a few minutes about his progress, the sensation returning to his legs, the physical therapy progressing faster than the orthopedic surgeons predicted, his return to part-time work at a veteran services non-profit. His sister's wedding is next month. He'll be able to attend on his feet. Everything is moving forward, everything is healing, and then he reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out something small and faded. A unit patch. Worn at the edges, sewn inside the lining of his jacket with military precision, the kind of stitching that only happens when someone has something they can't afford to lose. Laura's breath catches. It's the same patch. Not the same design, the same patch. The 3rd platoon insignia from Sangin Valley. From that extraction she's not supposed to remember, that extraction that left 17 wounded in a Black Hawk's cargo bay and her husband in a flag-draped coffin. Sangin, he says simply. 3rd platoon. I was there. You extracted us. The memory crashes through her like sudden pressure change, not the confusion of déjà vu, but the absolute certainty of recognition. 8 years ago. Night extraction. 17 wounded personnel moving through the darkness like ghosts, and a woman in combat boots with Corman's hands saving every one of them, even as the man beside her was already gone. The same man who's been dead for 8 years. The same man who's standing herein. The physical therapy wing telling her that some brothers and sisters in arms find each other, even when the government has officially decided they never existed. Some brothers and sisters, he continues, his voice steady as old steel, find each other even when the government pretends we never existed. Laura takes the patch with hands that finally tremble, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of surviving long enough to matter. Tears stream down her face freely now, unguarded, the kind of tears that only come when you've been permitted, finally, to remember. She pins the patch beside his on the bulletin board in his room, 2 pieces of faded cloth representing 17 people who came home because someone didn't stop fighting. Subscribe to the Code Whisperers and hit the notification bell, because the people who've carried the heaviest burdens often walk among us invisibly, pushing wheelchairs and holding steady hands and asking nothing except to be remembered as what they actually are.